For a long time I've been studying media audiences, beginning with television audiences, beginning with adults for often so-called trashy shows like soap operas and talk shows. And I've been really interested to understand why people that we think of in all kinds of serious ways in their daily lives, as workers, as voters, as engaged in the public world, why do we sometimes have such a pejorative view of them when they watch TV? And so my research has been concerned to listen more carefully to the justification and rationale that audiences themselves give when they engage with different media. And that tradition, that kind of body of work I've now carried into the study of children and families and how it is that they explain why and how they engage with the media that they choose and what significance that might have.
It's probably better to start by saying the study of audiences was the beginning of my research. So I was completely fascinated by audiences. Audiences together, en masse, in large groups, audiences in little groups, and then audiences as they dispersed and became individual viewers, but still felt part of an audience. And so when I started off doing audience research in 1999, what I was looking at was the move from cinema-based viewing to DVD and video-based viewing in the home. And I thought it would be a quite straightforward process of setting up some kind of observations and interviews with groups of people who self-identified as audiences. But as I got a little bit deeper into the research and I watched audiences watching each other and watching the same film multiple times, I realized that in the interviews, what I was collecting was a snapshot of an audience member describing a particular experience of viewing. And so audiences behave hugely differently when they're with different people. So you put let's say you put an audience of men watching a Hindi film in which there's a pornographic sequence into a room with lots and lots of women, older women, and they'll behave entirely differently. So watching audience behavior and describing audience behavior is also a completely fascinating thing. Over the years, I've worked on internet audiences who are entirely dispersed first and then come together. I've just come back from a trip to India where people make a date to watch a particular satirical comedy show online, even though it's aired weeks ago, but they'll make a date to come together and sit and watch it, even though they've all watched it separately. So you've got people constituting themselves as audiences rather than the text constituting them as audiences, because they're friendship groups that love watching things together and find it really interesting, or their families. So that movement from a group to an individual back into a group again, I think is something which we thought wasn't going to happen with the internet and is happening. So I'm totally fascinated by that.
Well, I research many things, media power, voice, ethics, but at core, I would say I remain an audience researcher. And the reason is when I moved into thinking and writing about media in the mid-90s, early 90s, the big games in town were production research then and textual analysis. And audience research was newer, important, but for me, it was obvious where my loyalty was. It was with audience research. And the reason was that for me, audience research was the only part of the field that was open to, if you like, the infinite complexity of what people do with media. A lot of which we didn't know anything about, and a lot of which was about to change fundamentally later in the 90s and in the 2000s. That for me was the great mystery and excitement. My supervisor was David Morley, one of the founders of audience research, certainly in the UK and in the Anglo-American field. And I thought this had to be the most exciting part of media. And that's remained, if you like, my sensibility ever since, because just as production has continued and distribution has become very interesting and complicated through the web, that mystery of what people do with the media, the endless series of new things they do with the media, that's the core of my research about media. And it doesn't stop being interesting, that's for sure.
So I generally study media and popular culture, and I look at different events or expressions or manifestations of popular culture in my work, and they are all. So I've written about the beauty pageant, and I've written about kids television, and I've written about brand culture and popular feminism and popular misogyny, and throughout all of this work, while I have been concerned with texts and how texts are formed and analyzing texts, I've also been concerned with how it is that people interpret, understand, navigate, and negotiate with these texts. And so for me, audiences are really about, I look at audiences in terms of consumers, and to see how people consume popular culture, what kinds of meanings they make out of popular culture, how they interpret popular culture as relevant to their own lives and use it in different ways. And so it's been television audiences, it's been brand managers, it's been makers on social media and users of social media. So audience, I really see audience as a kind of broad category.
In my research, I've always been interested in understanding how people construct a sense of identity and community. So how people try and hopefully find a place in the world, either as individuals or as groups. And I've always been intrigued on the role of the media, how important are media for people, for different individuals in different groups to find that place in the world with others and sometimes against others. So with this big question as a background, my research with audiences has spread across two main areas. The first one relates to migrants and diasporas, so how people who are spread across space, across countries, might use the media in different ways to link with people locally, nationally or transnationally. And the other strand of my research relates to urban citizens. So in many ways, the exact opposite, how people who are concentrated in a single space and who very often find themselves on top of each other and next to others that they might like or might not like, might use the media to negotiate their sense of self, find space, find community, but also to try to keep away who they might consider as strangers. So my most recent project has brought these two different groups together, migrants and urban citizens. I'm working now on a project called The Digital Making of the City of Refuge. So myself and my research team, we're looking at the ways that newcomers and established populations in cities might use digital communication and digital media to try to negotiate their distance or proximity from each other, try to understand each other, and sometimes try to keep away from each other.
Within the field of media and communications, I guess my research takes two broad avenues. One is on the effects of social media on political participation, broadly. So in this realm, basically trying to figure out how the uses of social media either cause or correlate or in some way contribute to increasing political participation or decreasing political participation, or maybe no effect at all on young people, basically, under the premise that young people's engagement with civic and electoral activities has been continuously decreasing over the last 60 years or so, and it continues to be a downturn trend. About 18 years ago, when I guess Web 2.0 sort of initiated, there was this optimism that that was going to help to increase youth political participation. And so I'm looking into whether or not that's actually the case. It's not, by the way. That's it. The second area sort of concerns general how media affects people's cognitions more subliminally and automatically. So operating from a cognitive science perspective of information processing. And then from that, trying to figure out the different ways in which media stimuli of various kinds affect people's either cultural or political sort of attitudes, practices, and beliefs.
So my research is really around digital media or new media, information and communication technologies, and that is it's not that common to talk about audiences in that sphere, but all the research and the work I've done in the past was really focused on audiences, and I'm trying to take that into this new digital sphere and looking at how we can think of users of ICTs, which is what they're normally called in this field, as audiences of various kinds, or maybe how we have to adjust what we understand audiences to be in this new digital age. And that's really kind of how audiences fit into my work. I would look at a diversity of audiences, so I really look at different groups of individuals with different backgrounds and how they interact and engage differently with these various media.